right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Leaving the Jar. Today is a pretty cool day. We have somebody who is pretty special. I'm going to let her introduce herself. The resume is kind of long, so there's no way for me to remember all of it. But we've done an episode on immigration and law before, and this is going to be our second episode, but a little bit different from a different angle. So, how are you doing, Monica?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, can we have you introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Sarah Salim Malad, and I have been working as an immigration attorney for 17 years, I think, working with trafficking survivors, or more generally, a wide range of humanitarian-based immigration cases. I've also worked with trafficking survivors on a more personal level through an agency known as the Samaritan Women, or currently Institute for Shelter Care. So that on a more personal level, and then more on a more professional level. My church, St. Barnabas and St. Susanna Coptic Orthodox Church in Baltimore, is also a mission center and serving the local community. So we're often exposed to people who've been victimized, neighborhood to be light and salt. Don't want to bore you with all the other details.
So just to start off, the first question I want to ask you, and we're going to be really asking everyone, is can you define in your own words what human trafficking is and what it entails?
So, okay. As an attorney, I would define it via the legal definition. And so, and I've gotten used to doing that in the cases that I have to present. I would define it, simply as exploitation, as seeing people as products, as things, not as human beings. But legally speaking, it is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, obtaining, or providing an individual by force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of sex or labor trafficking. And that's drilled into my mind. But of course, each individual story leaves its imprint. The word I think of when I think of human trafficking is insidious. It's a very, very dark crime.
So you mentioned that you've worked in this immigration field for quite a few years. Can you tell us a little bit about how many cases of trafficking you've handled over the years, whether through the organization that you work in now or other organizations?
Sure. So I was volunteering beginning in 2007 with the Samaritan Women Institute for Shelter Care. And through that, I was exposed on kind of a mentoring level to women who were survivors of trafficking. Over the years, I would say 20 to 30 survivors. We would provide programming to them on various holidays, and on occasion I did one-on-one mentor survivors. Sometimes I just did rides, like if someone had a class that they needed to attend, I would be their driver and get to spend those, whatever time I was with them. And that was really a joy. And something that came to me, it came to our parish actually, through one of our parishioners who introduced us to this anti-trafficking agency. And at the time, I knew very little about it. I was in law school at the time, in 2007. And then soon after I began working in immigration in 2008, I went into humanitarian-based immigration work and probably have worked with, I'd say, maybe around another 30 survivors, although they come with their families and their derivatives, we call them, either in the United States or abroad, or other attorneys who are doing that kind of work right now. Maybe they're newer in the field, but also we do a lot of peer review because these cases are difficult, and we really need to dot our I's and cross our T's to make sure that we're presenting a strong case to the government. And often because these crimes are so difficult to identify, they also have very, very little evidence. It's not the kind of case where we're able to present a really strong record. So we've got to work with these clients for a long time. And oftentimes they themselves don't know that they are trafficking survivors until they come to us for a screening and we're able to identify that this has happened in their past.
Can you talk a little bit more about what specific things you did as a mentor for the survivors?
Yeah, so, trying to be light and salt, trying to encourage them that they have value. We're very blessed that our holidays don't always line up with the survivors' holidays. So as a church community, we would come and sometimes provide a program for them on their holidays, or spend sometimes our holidays with them. And, you just recognize how beautiful and how valuable it is to spend that time with them. It's not really a sacrifice at all. And there's great delight in those one-time events. But as a mentor, kind of the day in and day out, and seeing them make decisions that you hope are leading them in the right direction. I think the hardest thing for me was remembering the last time I saw a survivor that I was working with, who the next week when I came to drive her to her driving class, I was told had gone back to her trafficker and ended up becoming a trafficker herself. And I read everything I possibly could in the news about her because I was just gripped with grief about this person, but just recognizing that, those are people that I have added to my prayer list because that's what I can do for them now, continuing to be present for those that are ready to receive care, that are ready to take that next step in their lives.
What happens in these episodes is Monica is usually really nice and soft, and I am usually very cynical and representing the cynical viewers that we have about this topic. I'm gonna take the opportunity to comment and ask about something that you mentioned. You said sometimes people who are trafficked don't even recognize that they're trafficked. Now, to the average person who's seeing us and who has never really followed what does it mean to be trafficked, that is a ridiculous statement to say, because how can I be trafficked and not know that I'm being trafficked? So can I ask you to kind of just delve into that a little bit more, how you saw it happen in front of you? How were they not aware that they're being trafficked?
Yeah, so when we talk about trafficking, remember, we're talking about, people predominantly think of sex trafficking, and so they think well, that's so obvious, but there's many ways where people become exploited slowly but surely into sex trafficking, and one thing leads to another. I'll give you just an example. Even in sex trafficking, often a trafficker will convince their victim that they're in a domestic relationship, even going as so far as to have children with the survivor, because that ties them together for life. And so, in the example that I gave you of the survivor that immediately comes to mind as somebody that I grieve. She initially escaped her trafficking, but her trafficker was the father. And so there's that connection that she could not escape. And there's lots of ways, I don't want to minimize it all, that people who are involved in sex trafficking that are used for commercial sex can be fooled into believing that they're not necessarily being exploited, but they're part of it, even to the point that they become traffickers themselves. But in the immigration context, which is specifically where I'm working in, oftentimes individuals who are ignorant of the laws in the United States, because their ignorance is weaponized against them, so they're told, you have no right to be here, and if you say anything, that will be used against you, and you're lucky that I took you in, and that, otherwise you'd be on the street. Or often they are escaping exploitation in their home country, and often if the trafficker themselves is aware of the exploitation that happens in the home country or has connections to them in the home country, then can use that information against their victim. Apart from sex trafficking, there's a whole world of labor trafficking where, another layer where people may be wholly unaware that they're being exploited. So for example, if a trafficker or if a good Samaritan, gives you a loan because they're aware that you need that money for your family, say in your home country, who are really poor, and then uses you for labor and says, you can pay me back by working for me, but then garnishes your wages because they gave you a ride somewhere, or because you needed clothing, you needed medication, that they're able to keep you in that cycle. Additionally, there's something called sort of I would say a bridge between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. It's called sexual servitude. So an example of that is a young girl whose case I was recently doing technical assistance on for another attorney in our office, who was brought here by her family to escape violence in her home country. And she was under the age of 18, but someone that they knew wanted a young wife to bear him children. And so she ends up in this, he's convinced her that this is a domestic relationship, but in fact it's not. It's sexual exploitation, it's sexual servitude, it's trafficking. So a lot of times we can think of really simplistic scenarios and not understand how complex these scenarios really can be. So we're not also thinking from the lens of trauma, because we're looking at it from a really privileged and a really educated point of view and saying, how could someone not know? But that's not taking into account, and even myself, I mean, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I'm not an expert on that. I've learned what I can so that I can be well informed and trauma informed for my clients, but that's not my training, But the little that I know has shown me that even my own biases, like, how could someone not be aware of that? That comes from a very privileged, and it comes from my own ignorant place, to be honest, because I'm not aware of how trauma works.
So from what I'm hearing and from my understanding, obviously this subject just requires, I think, people to have a lot of empathy towards the situation, which can be difficult if you've never been in any sort of experience or seen any sort of experience of that sort. And so if we're going to continue down this cynical route a little bit, can you give or provide some insight maybe onto why someone might go back to trafficking, like you mentioned with the survivor that you talked about? Why they would go back, or why they might, again, not, I guess, be looped back into the cycle and even become a trafficker themselves.
Right. Yeah. I think, sometimes a trafficking survivor has been convinced by her trafficker that there is no one else that will love them. And especially if they are connected to their trafficker. I don't know the statistics around this, but many people are trafficked by relatives, trafficked by people that they have some sort of relationship with. And so they're often convinced that, no one else is going to love you. You are damaged, and you're tied to me for life, either by a child, maybe tied through an addiction, because the trafficker has gone out of their way to slowly but surely introduce this addiction. There are so many reasons, why they would not be able to come out of that cycle. In terms of immigrant survivors, there are, I don't want to say so many more reasons, but that's really my lens as an immigration attorney, and often the law is used against them. And, so for example, a trafficking survivor who doesn't have a good command of the English language, her trafficker may hurt themselves and call the police on them, so that person now has a criminal record and their credibility is diminished. And we're fortunate to be in areas where we have law enforcement that's bilingual, or may have access to a language line, but many places don't have that. And so the legal process can be used against them.
And you also have such a special perspective, because you really did get to see it from both a legal standpoint, which, in a lot of sense is not necessarily very subjective. It's a little bit more objective. And you also got to see it from a firsthand, just working emotionally with survivors. Mm-hmm. Do you think that dual perspective has affected how you are now as an immigration lawyer?
Certainly, because, the law is very, very specific in the parameters so trafficking is very broad. And there are lots of people who are trafficking survivors. Within that is the T visa, which is what makes you eligible for relief in the United States. So unfortunately, that has really, really sort of strict parameters, and unfortunately the law sometimes doesn't account for things that are outside of that. There's such a wide range of people who could be considered survivors that wouldn't necessarily qualify for immigration benefits. And I also have gotten to see it from the standpoint of US born or US citizens who could be exploited. I think, it's totally, I think comparing and contrasting the two is like a topic of its own almost. But I am thankful to have had the opportunity to see it, to work one-on-one with survivors and build that empathy, because sometimes the legal space isn't super empathetic. It's, where you dot your I's and you cross your T's and you make your case, and even sometimes it's a little bit re-traumatizing for survivors because you have to gather information, but that's not necessarily where the survivor is. They're still working through the trauma, and that can be a lifelong process, and here I am trying to make a strong case and potentially re-traumatizing that person. Yeah, that has been helpful to me, especially working in this space and not having a counseling background myself. It's been helpful to have the opportunity to have more one-on-one with the survivors.
All right. Here's a blue sky exercise. Let's say we were to hand you the entire legal system tomorrow and say change 2 things to help trafficking survivors, or 3 things to help trafficking survivors reach a good end state for them in an easier way, less traumatizing way, while taking into account how those changes will affect everyone else. What would come to mind?
So immediately I think of immigrant survivors of trafficking do not have access to counsel. Okay, so I work for a nonprofit immigration legal services agency, and we are able to assist somewhere between 15 and 20% of the callers. The demand for the services is extremely high, and there are also plenty of private practitioners that are, doing their best to provide these services, in pro bono capacity or low bono capacity. But I would entitle these survivors to representation, because it is really, really difficult to put these cases together by themselves. And that doesn't just go for trafficking survivors. There's a whole host of humanitarian-based cases where people need representation because they've been exploited. And so to try to present their case on their own is a really tall order. I would also say, especially in the climate that we're in right now, survivors are really, really worried. Like the point of the Human Trafficking Act was to encourage people to come forward to report crimes, knowing that they are going to be safe from criminal penalties, whether they be a U.S. citizen who is, who's been accused themselves of being a trafficker, whether, a human trafficker or a drug trafficker. Because that's a tactic, right? That they get them, the trafficker gets them a criminal record, and so they then are wanted by law enforcement themselves. The victim is wanted by law enforcement. And likewise, in the immigration context, individuals who are undocumented, who are trafficking survivors, are afraid of government enforcement against them. They're afraid that they're going to be deported. They're afraid of family separation. And so, the whole purpose behind this was that survivors could come forward with this crime and not fear that they themselves would be penalized. And I think we need to create policies that get us back to that purpose, to make sure that survivors who are coming forward to report, feel confident that they can do that. And that requires a lot of training, particularly for law enforcement at the front lines. So I think, these kind of 2 pieces of making sure that they themselves are not criminally penalized, that law enforcement gets the training that they need on these issues, and then also just having the trauma-informed counseling, trauma-informed care, and legal representation, because it's really difficult to do without service providers that are there advocating for you.
John, I'm wondering for you, since you previously worked in law enforcement, do you feel like that what you just said was something feasible that you think could actually be a training that's implemented, or do you think it might be a little out of reach?
So you're working in a humanitarian field, and maybe I don't work in that field, so sometimes I don't view things from the same perspective. And my first thought is taxpayers. And if I'm an American taxpayer, from a non-humanitarian perspective, why do I want to provide all these services to somebody who entered a country illegally to begin with? I'm just wondering, what, for me,
I got a response for you.
I don't know. Yeah, I want to hear that response, because I don't even know how I'm voting. If I had to vote on this thing, I have no idea which way to go. The light and the salt in me, the Christ in me wants to say yes.
Right.
And the American taxpayer wants to say no.
Oh, I hear you, because we care about the bottom line. So if you want me to set aside that these are human beings that have value apart from it, I can do that for you for just a second, and just say that law enforcement needs to be able to prosecute crime. That is something that is important for everyone. The safety of our neighborhoods, our towns, our cities, our states, our countries needs law enforcement to be able to effectively arrest, prosecute, and that requires the cooperation of survivors. You can't do that without the victims of the crime. And so making sure that crime victims whether they be US citizens, whether they be lawfully here, whether they be undocumented, know that law enforcement is on their side, that they're not, in terms of, they can come forward, they can report these crimes, and they can feel confident to testify. I mean, that is what's often used against them. Often what our traffickers, and in other contexts too, our domestic violence survivors, they are often also afraid from their abusers. So traffickers, abusers, other criminals are telling, their victims, don't come forward and report to law enforcement. They will never believe you. They will not be on your side. And weaponizing the legal system to create that fear. And so, this is in the interest of everyone. It's in everyone's interest.
And I really love...
So I was ready to come. No, you asked me the question and I was like, I'm right here.
I actually really love that you said that, because I think so often we think that these things are not going to happen to us or to someone that we know, but it can really truly happen to anyone. And the implementation of things like trainings for law enforcement wouldn't just be to help people who, came here illegally or whatever. It really is to help everyone. And I think just having people be knowledgeable on these things in general, like if law enforcement is knowledgeable, it can help just in the legal system, and it's a domino effect from there. And I think it's really, really important, and I love that you said that.
And I'll be honest with you, I put that hat on for you, okay, because you asked me to do that, but I feel very, very strongly that we forget that we are talking about human beings, and it's really easy to make them the other. It is so easy, whether like we separate ourselves, by all kinds of things, by education, by immigration status, by our faiths, somehow those people are other. But, what we're talking about. And when we make policies and we make laws, we have to know that we are talking about individuals who are the beloved sons and daughters of God. They're made in His image, just like I am. And, working with survivors all these years, this may sound funny to you, but every time I work with survivor, I'm like, this person, regardless of their background, regardless of what they are done, this person is like better than me. Like, I mean, take that for what, I'm always humbled by them. Like, this is a person that is closer to God than me. Their suffering has made them, they've suffered if He's suffered. They've seen something of God that I haven't seen, and their faith is strengthened by that. And it's just so beautiful. They, and God knows why He's put them in that situation and why He's put me in this situation. We were all birthed at a particular time, particular place, for a particular purpose. So He knows why He's allowed that suffering for them. But it makes for their purification, and it's beautiful and really, really humbling.
Look, I think you've sold me. If I'm voting to take care of everybody. You mentioned that we always think of the other. It's me and there's the other. The other day I was talking to somebody and they mentioned something similar to that, but they said that they did a study and they grabbed like red-haired Scottish like humans, right? And they just took a bunch of them and they put them in a room. All practically look the same, all practically come from the same background. And because they had so much in common, they very quickly tried to figure out who's left-handed and who's right-handed. So like, even no matter how common you are, or like no matter how much you have in common, I think you're right. People are always gonna try to like categorize and put people in boxes. I wanna thank you for the time that you spent with us here today. I really don't wanna end this episode. So I'm like trying to rack my brain.
Let's just keep going, please.
I want to do like one more.
Can I say though, I really appreciate you all giving me the space to articulate. It's important, especially when it gets to be tiring doing the work, to continue to articulate why we do it. And so I just really enjoyed talking with you both and just kind of getting the chance to articulate the why, and why is it so meaningful. It energizes me to continue. Thanks.
One last question that we ask anybody that deals with trafficking victims.
Yeah.
What's the youngest you've ever seen?
Well, my mentee who went back to trafficking had a baby. Well, that baby himself was not the trafficking survivor. He was a victim. This is a new child that's being born to a victim and her trafficker. So I think that's really what sits on my heart, is like, God, you know. This is your son or this is your daughter, regardless of the age, but something just strikes you about a baby being born into that. And so...
Born a victim.
Yeah. And so, I don't know, the Lord, what can I say?
I'm going to also ask you one more follow-up question
Sure.
so we don't end on a negative note. So if you can give a very quick 30-second just message of hope to anyone who might be listening, who is either maybe a victim or a survivor or just a random person like me, what would you want to say?
Yeah. I would want to say that I don't want to appear to have all the answers. I just want to help in any way I can. And I know that there are a lot of service providers out there or people who have no knowledge whatsoever who want to offer hope, who want to help you find a way out. And so if there's any way that you would allow us to walk alongside of you, that would be a privilege to be able to walk alongside someone who is a survivor. You may be convinced that no one would love you or you have no value apart from this trafficking dynamic, but that's not true. You're loved, and come forward and receive that from the service providers and from your Lord.
All right. So earlier it was mentioned that there's prayer lists that people who meet traffickers end up making for themselves, because if there's nothing physically that they can do for them, maybe they reach a point where prayer is the last thing that they can provide. If you're watching the show and there's somebody that you know and you feel like you don't have any power to do anything for them, we're going to leave some resources at the bottom of this episode for you. But in the meantime, tell us and we'll pray with you, and we'll make sure that that prayer list keeps getting bigger and bigger, so we're constantly praying and putting the names of these trafficking survivors in front of the Lord. We love you guys for being here with us. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you next time.